Back in the mid-2000s, I was kind of known for encouraging atheists and skeptic groups to increase the number of women and non-white people in general on stage at conferences, because doing so would have a wide range of benefits. And I always got a lot of pushback for that, from, let's be honest, mostly white men, but also the occasional white woman who argued that diversity for diversity's sake isn't worth exploring, and that a diverse movement isn't inherently better than a movement of mostly white men. My most common answer to that argument was to point out that platforming diverse speakers would help a larger diversity of people feel more welcome and comfortable being a part of that community, which would help the community grow just on a pure numbers basis. But also having diverse speakers would allow us to explore issues that a mostly white male group might not even realize are important skeptic or atheist issues. For instance, skeptics rarely concern themselves with the vast amount of pseudoscience floating around the anti-abortion movement. It didn't really affect them, so it didn't occur to them to really push back on that. One thing I didn't really mention a lot was how simply being around a diversity of people might make the mostly white male skeptic atheist community better, more socially liberal people. And yes, just for the record, the science says more liberal, like the science I'm about to talk about. It's actually about how diversity makes people more liberal. And I am interpreting that as better. You might disagree with that, maybe because you're a conservative and you don't think that, for instance, believing black people are poorer and more likely to end up in prison because they're inferior to white people, or that women shouldn't be able to make decisions about their bodies, or that taxing billionaires won't improve society, or that people don't have a basic human right to health care and homes and food and education. You might not think that having those views makes you a bad person. That's a moral argument I'm not going to get into here, though I will point out that as an amoral argument, copious amounts of research shows that all of these liberal ideals do make society better for everyone. But if you don't understand that literature, then we're just going to have to disagree on whether or not people becoming more liberal over time is a good thing. But I'm going to continue to refer to it as a good thing for the rest of this video. So you might as well just turn it off or get used to it at this point. So this month in Science Advances, political scientists at Harvard have published a pretty bonkers long-term study involving 650,000 Americans, which found that white men who grew up in the 1940s in a neighborhood with at least one black neighbor were more likely to be Democrats 70 years later. 70 years. Just because they had a black neighbor when they were a kid. Okay, so this paper is called Childhood Cross-Ethnic Exposure Predicts Political Behavior 7 Decades Later. Evidence from Linked Administrative Data. And let me just start by saying that that is a garbage headline. The researchers point out in the study itself, we restrict our searches to men since the common practice of surname changes at marriage during the 20th century makes it quite difficult to link women accurately. They were absolutely dealing with a buttload of data. That's a scientific term. So I don't fault them for taking the easier road here and tracking men instead of the entire population. But if researchers published a paper in which they studied more than 500,000 people and all of them happen to be women, I guarantee that the word women or females would appear in the headline. And it would be made crystal clear that this isn't necessarily a phenomenon that applies across all people. This is one of the many small clues that you can find that tell us that male is seen as the default. 650,000 people were studied, and all of them came from a subset of 49% of the total population, but that wasn't considered important enough to be mentioned in the headline. On the positive side, when I searched for mainstream news articles about this paper, most of them seem to have gotten it right, mostly based on, I think, an LA Times article whose title is "White Boys Who Grew Up with Black Neighbors Are More Likely to Become Democrats, Study Finds." So that's good. But I digress. The researchers were interested in the topic of how diversity impacts people over the long term because of a number of studies that have shown that in the short term, diversification can have negative results. For instance, a non-peer-reviewed analysis by the Wall Street Journal found that the more rapidly a county has diversified since the start of this century, the more likely voters there were to cast ballots for the Republican nominee. Of course, the start of the century was only 20 years ago, and we're talking about adults who lived in mostly white communities for most of their lives before seeing an influx of people who weren't like them, which may have led to a knee-jerk racist reaction that people like Donald Trump and other Republican fearmongers exploited. So these researchers wanted to know what the results of diversity were for the long term. Not just how adults react immediately, but how a child exposed to diversity may differ from their peers 70 years later. They looked at census data from 1940, and back then the way that was gathered was by workers going door to door through 99% of American households, listing neighbors next to each other. So the researchers were able to see exactly how close white boys were to black families. Were they next door? Were they 2 doors down, a few streets over? Then they looked at census data from California, North Carolina, and Nebraska 60 to 70 years later. They chose those states because in those places, they asked for place of birth in their census, which let the researchers accurately connect people from the neighborhoods where they grew up to their current political affiliation. Happily, those 3 states included boys who grew up all over the United States who had then moved there, so they still got a good spread of geography for their data. And they found that white boys who grew up immediately next to black families were 1.5 to 5.3% more likely to be registered Democrats 70 years later, compared to white boys who didn't have black neighbors. That's millions of people who are more likely to believe in racial justice today than would have existed had the United States been even more segregated back in 1940 than it already was. I know what you're thinking. Correlation isn't causation. Maybe those boys, those white boys, had liberal families who chose to live next to black families. Maybe those boys simply held onto the Southern Democrat label, which back in 1940 was super racist. Maybe they just never bothered to change their affiliation. Well, they controlled for all of that by looking at people who had lived in their residence for at least 5 years prior to the 1940 census, so they didn't just move to a neighborhood to be near black families, by looking at just northern households, which didn't have that Southern Democrat label. And in every case, the data was crystal clear. Having a black neighbor as a kid made a more liberal elderly person. And because that trend was clear for immediate neighbors, but didn't hold for neighbors further away, the researchers say that it's likely that this effect happens not just because of black families existing in that neighborhood, but because of those families interacting with these white boys who come to see black families maybe as fully realized human beings just like themselves, and not as an other. The researchers conclude the relationship between early life experiences and party registration persists over this long period despite the many intervening life experiences during this period, including the population of study being one of the more economically and geographically mobile populations in American history, and with a large portion of the men experiencing the social disruption of military service. This persistence suggests a dominating socializing force of early life experiences. The long-term persistence of this relationship suggests that, despite the short-term social inefficiencies associated with diversity, there may be long-term positive effects for social harmony. So hey, calling for a more diverse atheist and skeptic community might have inspired a bunch of white men to become virulent women haters, but maybe in the long run, we'll be better off for it. I'll check back in with them in another 50 years or so.